pleasure to have an interview with Francesca Rosignoli. She's an Italian PhD from the University of Rome. Now she's working in Stockholm, where she has a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Stockholm, and she's working on the issues related to environmental justice, and in particular to environmental refugees and climate refugees. She's also collaborating to environmental humanities project at the University of Stockholm, and she's member of a think tank, the Environmental Justice Institute of Berlin. Hi, Francesca, and welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Monica. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so we would like to discuss with you the concept of environmental justice, which has emerged now almost 30 years ago in the United States, but is still a controversial concept. And you just published a book which name in Italian is Giustizia ambientale, come sono nate e cosa sono le disuguaglianze ambientali, published by Castelvecchi, which name in English should be Environmental Justice, and it's a book about the histories of environmental inequalities, and where you describe the concept and meaning of environmental justice. So I would like to ask you if you could please give us a definition of this concept and of its history.
Yes, thanks for this introduction and for the question. Well, as I wrote in my book, it's not an easy task to define what environmental justice is. It's a concept that was born in the US, as you mentioned before, and it evolves out of the grassroots movements in the US against the unfair allocation of toxic waste within the society. So basically, in the late 70s, early 80s in the US, there were, those kind of movements that basically started to fight against the fact that a lot of waste facilities or toxic waste were always, or in the majority of cases, located in the in the close proximity of Afro-American communities, ethnic minorities, and low-income people. So I would say that environmental justice comes from experiences of collective injustice in the first place, and what those movements wanted to affirm was the principle that it was really unjust that certain communities were most affected by environmental burdens, so environmental risks, we would say, and they didn't have any role in the decision behind this allocation. So it's not just a problem of distribution, but also a matter of recognition. So those people felt like, it's just because we are Black, or just because we are poor, that you didn't include us into the discussion on how to allocate environmental risks or environmental goods, depends on within the society. So basically the goal of environmental justice, and I would say its definition would be could be the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all in the decision-making process and the participation in implementing environmental policies. And this fair treatment, of course, should be, regardless of the color or race or income, level of education, and so on. So what I tried to make clear in my book is that the justice of environmental justice. Sorry for this repetition, but that's the way it is made up, of 3 dimensions. We have the distribution, the recognition, and the participation. So in other words, the thing is that environmental risks and environmental amenities should be, distributed in a fair way within the society, and all people should be recognized as actors in the decision-making process. And since they are recognized, that of course they can participate also in the implementation of environmental policies. And so I hope I answered your question in this way.
Yes, thank you. And the second question is partially linked to the first one, because we know that, as you just mentioned, the environmental justice and social justice are strictly linked. But it's important also to mention the relationship between environmental justice and organized crime, which in some countries is stronger than in others. And I would like to ask you if you can stress a bit this concept and describe the kind of relationship that there is.
Yes, thanks for the question. So I will start by, saying just a few words on the relationship between environmental justice and social justice, and then I will go further, explain the relationship between environmental justice and organized crime, because of course there is another connection. So the thing with the environmental justice and social justice is that basically environmental justice comes from civil rights movements and introduces a different understanding of environmentalism. So the thing is that environmental justice focuses more on human justice than environment in a way, and explicitly links ecological concerns with social justice. So the main idea, as I said before, is that certain groups suffer an equal allocation of environmental burdens and are excluded from the decision-making process because of who they are. So they are discriminated depending on the social markers, and that's, here we can see the connection with social justice. So in a few words, I would answer by quoting Chico Mendes, who said that environmentalism without class struggle is gardening. So this is the main aspect of environmental justice. And now you would say, well, but what's the relationship between this concept with organized crime? Well, the fact is that if we look very, if we have a closer inspection on environmental justice, we will see that basically suffering an environmental injustice means that certain communities basically lose control over their territory. That's the main consequences when decisions are made without taking into account all people that live in the same area. So with organized crime, we basically experience the same phenomenon, because organized crime ultimately deprives not only the state, but above all the communities of a certain area by dispossessing them of the control over their territory. So in my book, I explored 2 cases in particular. On the one hand, I emphasized a lot the struggles in Sicily by Danilo Dolci in the late 60s in Italy, and then the case of Land of Fires in the Campania region. As for Danilo Dolci, I focused on the struggles that he initiated to force the local and national authorities to build the dam on the Iato River. And so I identified in Dolci's activities the origin of environmental justice in Italy, because that project was not just a development project in a poor area of Italy, like it was Sicily, but it was also a way to contrast mafia's monopoly on water supply. So Dolci first realized that basically the key role of environmental policies is to, contrast poverty, social injustices, and also organized crime. So in this way, the key to overcome all those inequalities, all those injustices, was to improve in a way environmental policies to overcome this situation, basically. And so in other words, environmental policies can well restore, give back affected communities control over their territory. And on the other hand, I also mentioned the Land of Fires case. In Italian would be Terra dei Fuochi. And I identified in 2015 a sort of turning point, because in 2015 it was introduced in our country, in Italy, the law against eco-crimes. And this reaffirms this idea that environmental inequalities, at least in Italy, are strictly related with the with crimes also pushed by the organized crime. So I think that the Land of Fires case, it's an important case study to show how the illegal disposal of toxic waste was mainly due to the illegal activity of the local mafia and its relationship with entrepreneurs and sometimes even the state. But in my book, I just focused on this interplay between the mafia and the local mafia that is in the Campania region, is Camorra, and certain entrepreneurs. And so that was just to show, that in Italy there is this variable, constant variable, at least, that we can identify in the role of organized crime in this activity, to still, I would say, the control over the territory of certain communities.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting to better understand this relationship between mafia and the organized crime. The case study was particularly interesting for us, but now I would like to go on a more global level. And the third question is, I would like to ask you about the geography that these environmental inequalities are determining, because as you already affirmed, inhabitants should be in charge of decide, or at least have the possibility to decide about the environmental policy related to the environment where they live. But we also know that this is not always the case, because often in this globalized capitalistic world, the sustainable the choices are not environmentally sustainable, and are based on economic interests that are often driving this the creation of this policy, which are based on economical interest instead of environmental sustainability. And so this is part of a new kind of environmental inequalities, especially in this particular period of climate change that we are living. And so I would like to ask you about the geography that are emerging from these new inequalities, environmental inequalities.
Well, I believe that the current unfair distribution of environmental risks in the framework of climate change, of course, is likely to reproduce sacrifice zones at a global scale. The concept of sacrifice zones is also part of my book, and it means that basically for certain, big companies, or for the main interest of a state, perhaps it's, one can accept also the possibility that you are going to sacrifice, let's say, a certain community in the name of something else, so in the name of the growth or whatever. And if we look at at this problem from the perspective of climate change on a global level, well, we can identify a growing number of those sacrifice zones on the one hand, and also the rise of a sort of climate apartheid, as it was named in our times. So the main consequence is that the communities that are less responsible for carbon emissions are likely to pay, the highest price. So on the one hand, I think that climate change is aggravating existing environmental inequalities, for example, in the global south. And on the other hand, it's creating new routes, new geographies of environmental inequalities, for example, in the far north. So if you look at the global south, I think that the most tricky problem would be climate-induced migration. So the fact that people are forced to move because of the impacts of climate change, and this will be, worse and worse in the future. And especially people from Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And on the other hand, if you look at the far north, the situation could be even worse, because indigenous communities that live in the Arctic region will face two challenges. On the one hand, they will face a second round of dispossession in a way, because the Arctic region is becoming a land of new opportunities, because many environmental resources will be available thanks to the global warming, and this will exacerbate the environmental conflicts or wars to get those new opportunities, those new resources. So we can see this phenomenon when we see, for example, Trump asking to buy Greenland from Denmark, and all those developed countries that would like to to take those coming environmental resources. And on the other hand, the far north also is experiencing the disproportionate sharing of environmental risk because of the the global warming, and this phenomenon basically is compromising both their material relief, because they depend a lot on environmental resources that are becoming scarce in this period, and also is likely to compromise also their cultural survival, because many cultural traditions are very linked to to the environment where people live. So I think, in the near future, the situation will become very difficult, for probably more for the far north than for the global south. But it's just my opinion, and this is probably more part of my current research here in Stockholm. I didn't go so into I didn't explore that much this topic in my book, but probably this will be the the main topic of the second book I'm working on. But thanks for all those questions.
Well, thank you for discussing the content of your first book, and I hope there will be soon the chance to discuss also the content of the second book, that which seems very interesting. So thank you very much, Francesca.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica, for this interview and for inviting me. It's yeah, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.